Civility is a funny thing, isn't it? Usually, the main character is clearly the good guy, while whoever opposes them is obviously evil, and there's no room for any extra nuance whatsoever. Except, just like in real life, things aren't always that simple. Some villains might not be so bad, and some heroes are far from heroic. That's what I'm here to talk about today, in video games. I realize with an intro like that, I could be talking about a whole host of things, but just like always, I'm talking about video games. Here are my rules for this list. To start with, I'm not including the same game on both lists, because that would probably lead to me repeating myself a lot. Second, with the villains list, they don't need to be justified or even rational with what they're doing. They just need to be in a position where you can sympathize with them. As for the heroes, their evil deeds cannot be optional. It would be so easy to fill up this list with characters like Cole McGrath or Evan Redgrave, because their games have karmic decisions. These are characters who are evil regardless of what you do. Then of course there's the one per franchise and the only games I've played rule, and that's about it. Let's get started. When it comes to lists about things like story and characters, I usually try to steer clear of licensed games. The reason for this is very simple. Since licensed games are based off of pre-existing properties, I would essentially just be talking about that property instead of the game. I mean, let's be real, it would be kinda ridiculous to call Darth Vader a video game villain just because of a couple Star Wars games. My only exception to this is when the game does something new. So while I really wanted to put Dr. Octavius from the new Spider-Man game on this list, I can't, because I'm sure he's portrayed similarly in the comics. Telltale's Joker works though. Joker, or as he's called in Batman the Telltale series, John Doe, is unlike any versions of Joker we've seen in the past, at least in terms of what people remember. I'm sure there's some obscure comic out there that contradicts me. Anyway, while Joker here is crazy and has a love for wanton chaos, he isn't outright malicious. Once he breaks out of Arkham in Season 2, he goes to visit Bruce and actually sees him as a friend and even tries to cheer him up at Lucius's funeral. Also, unlike most Batman media, where Joker's relationship with Harley is beyond abusive, here it's a lot more innocent. John simply has a crush on Harley and tries to get on her good side, to the point where there's even a scene of Bruce giving him dating advice. Throughout the season, you get the feeling that John wants to be a good person, but he's terrible at doing so. In fact, there's a story path where he becomes a vigilante in an attempt to help clean up Gotham. Unfortunately though, regardless of what you pick, John becomes too unstable by the end and needs to be taken down. It really is a shame because it feels like if things turned out differently, John could have been rehabilitated. But that's Telltale for you. Your choices impact the story, so long as they don't actually change what happens. Since we're about to deal with all kinds of murderers on this list, we might as well start with a little white-collar crime. Shakedown Hawaii is a game about a man who brings his company back from the brink of ruin. Now, that doesn't sound evil, it sounds perfectly fine, inspiring even, until you figure out how he did it. Now, I sort of lied about the white-collar crimes thing. What Feeble Multinational does isn't illegal for the most part, but it is really scummy. Here's a simple formula of how the CEO, who I don't think actually has a name, operates. He encounters a scam in his everyday life, gets annoyed by it, and implements it into his own company for a profit. Devaluing products, confusing user agreements, extra tacked on fees. If it's a scam that's being used nowadays, chances are Feeble Multinational has implemented it. And that's without going into the titular shakedowns in this game. You see, when a place isn't willing to sell, the boss will shake them down mafia style until they agree to. Heck, you can even shake down places you already own just for the protection money. And of course, the game isn't truly won until Feeble owns everything on the island. The boss is lower on the list because his crimes aren't as violent as the others, but it's still hard to argue what he's doing is good for society. Since Psychonauts is a game where you go into other people's minds, having the villains being sympathetic seems almost inevitable. Simply put, you get to see the inner demons that drove them to do what they did. Sure, Coach Oleander did try to take over the world, but it was out of bitterness from not being able to join the army due to his height and PTSD from his father's butcher shop. And once the atrocity that is the meat circus is finished, Oleander goes back to his usual self. But wait a minute, didn't Psychonauts have another villain? That's right, Dr. Lobato. You know, this guy.
Now hold still. This will only hurt until your brains come flying out.
Now, how can an utter lunatic like this be sympathetic? Well, the answer lies in the VR spin-off, Rhombus of Ruin. In the game, Raz encounters Lobato and goes into his mind. At first, things seem simple enough. Well, as simple as Psychonauts can be anyway. You're on a ship with Lobato and you fight a giant version of him. But when he's defeated, a vault appears. And then, in a pretty hilarious fashion, using felt plushies, the game explores the Doctor's tragically morbid backstory. Remember the first game, how Raz thought his father hated him for being psychic? Well, it was the same story for Lobato. Only his parents actually did hate him. The dehumanizing way they talk about him, while done in a funny and over-the-top way, is still deeply disturbing. In fact, they had a medical procedure done on him to try to make him not psychic anymore. And it's so disturbing, Raz couldn't even bring himself to say what it was.
Your parents took you and... They took you and... Oh, man.
They do keep it pretty vague, but the fight beforehand does imply that the shower cap Lobato always wears is to cover his exposed brain. The whole thing gives off some serious conversion therapy vibes, and after Raz sees it, Lobato comes to his senses and stops his evil plan. Honestly, I hope they do more with Lobato in Psychonauts 2, because Rhombus of Ruin made him go from a one-dimensional but still entertaining villain to one of the most interesting characters in the series. One thing I've been trying to do with this list is avoid characters from games where the main premise is the fact that you're a criminal. Travis Touchdown and the boss from Saints Row could have easily made this list, but I feel like I would have been saying the same basic stuff for most of them. However, there is one example that was so blatant I just couldn't ignore it. Trevor Phillips. Trevor is the human embodiment of every insane rampage GTA players have gone on. He's violent, vulgar, insane, and will kill someone on a hair trigger. His introduction to the player shows him having sex with a dude's girlfriend, and when he complains about it, killing him. Also, there's the matter of his two acquaintances. There's his best friend Ron, who he threatens to kill from time to time, and Wade, who has an intellectual disability. And it's heavily implied Trevor kidnapped him and killed his friends. Heck, he even kills Wade's cousin later on in a random fit of rage. And that's just the tip of the iceberg with this powder keg of insanity that is Trevor Phillips. Honestly, there's way too much for me to mention it all right here. Now, just from that, you may think Trevor deserves to be number one. But there's more to him than that. He does seem to have really genuine friendships with Michael, Franklin, Lamar, and yes, even Ron. Not to mention, he does have some principles as well. He hates private mercenary armies, he believes women should be treated with respect, at least sometimes, and he puts a high value on loyalty. If you opt to kill Michael in the finale, he'll refuse to help you and will never forgive Franklin for it, even though he was beyond mad at Michael at the time. Despite that though, Trevor is still a violent, dangerous lunatic, so he still belongs on this list. Mario is pretty much the last series you would expect for a list like this. The games aren't exactly known for their complex stories. Usually, it's as simple as Bowser kidnapping Peach. The RPGs do have more in-depth stories, but even then, there isn't a whole lot of moral complexity on display. It's not like Grodus or Fawful had sympathetic motives for trying to take over the world. Count Bleck, on the other hand, is an entirely different story. The funny part is that at first, Bleck seems like any other over-the-top Mario villain. He just wants to destroy the universe because reasons. However, as the game progresses, his backstory slowly unfolds and his true motives become clear. Black was originally known as Blumiere and belonged to a tribe of ancients. He fell in love with a human woman named Timpani, but his father banished her out of prejudice and cursed her to walk through the dimensions until she died. Consumed by grief, the whole world lost all meaning to Black, and he became hell-bent on destroying it. What really makes Black interesting is the fact that while he acts tough at first, it's clear he feels no joy in what he's doing. Even when Nastasia tries to talk him out of it, he just uses the excuse that things are too far along for him to stop it. Heck, he even shows a lot of compassion towards his minions, never punishing them directly for their failures, and even offering to let Nastasia leave if she wants to. And at the end of the game, when he realizes that Timpani is still alive in the form of your in-game partner, he sacrifices himself to stop the Chaos Heart from destroying all worlds. Just in case you forgot, this was in a Mario game, of all things. Well, if they're dealing with characters this complex, I can't wait to see what they do in the sequel. Oh, you gotta be kidding me! As I've said a surprising number of times at this point, The Cave is a game about people pursuing what they desire most and how that's not always a good thing. Every character does something horrible in order to get what they want. I could pick one of them for this spot, but I think it would be most fitting to give it to all of them. Let's go through these 7 deadly characters sin by sin, shall we? There's Sloth, represented by the Knight, as he's just a mere peasant who pretends to be a knight and is unable to protect the kingdom from the dragon. Lust is represented by the Hillbilly, who falls in love with a girl at the carnival, but when she turns him down, he burns the entire place to the ground. Pride, the adventurer. She wants all the glory from her discoveries, and when her partners get mad at her for hogging all the credit, she kills them. Envy, the time traveler. She gets jealous of a coworker who wins an award she believed she deserved, so she goes back to the prehistoric age and wipes out his entire family line. Gluttony, kind of. The twins. These two just want to murder their parents so they can play outside. They only really count as gluttony because their final attempt involves poisoning a bowl of soup. Greed, the scientist. She makes a breakthrough discovery and sells it to a weapons manufacturer, resulting in the deaths of millions. And finally, Wrath, represented by the monk. He gets angry over the years as he repeatedly fails training, and when he doesn't get the position to lead the monastery, he snaps and kills his master. Now, I'm not gonna say all of these are equal evils. The knight really just made a mistake, and I could probably pick one of them as the worst, but since each of them represents one of the 7 deadly sins, I think it only makes sense to group them all together. Also, I'm well aware that I'm technically breaking the rules here, as each one of them does have an ending where they don't do the horrible deed. However, most people wouldn't know that without looking it up. The game is set up so the default path is the characters doing that evil deed. The whole premise is built around the protagonists being horrible people, so I think it still makes sense to put them here. Early on, the overarching story of the Danganronpa franchise focuses on what seems like a pretty clear-cut conflict: the battle between hope and despair. The heroes hold out hope, while fighting against the hopelessness perpetuated by a bloodthirsty teddy bear and a despair fetishizing fashion model. Then, Ultra Despair Girls comes out, and you're fighting against a group of villains called the Warriors of Hope. The Warriors of Hope are a group of elementary school students who have ushered in a new world order where kids run things. It's a lot like that Fairly OddParents episode, School's Out the Musical. Only, instead of adults taking on the typical roles of children, they instead take on the typical roles of corpses. Yeah, these kids sick an army of Monokumas on Toa City and have them slaughter any adults, or as they call them, demons, they can find. Now, why are they doing this? Well, I'll give you a hint, it's not because they were sick of broccoli and homework. Remember in Darkest Games Round 2, when I lumped every Danganronpa game into one spot? Well, if I had to choose, I think I found a winner here. Each of the Warriors of Hope has experienced some form of extreme child abuse. Whether it's physical, psychological, sexual, or whatever the hell Nagisa's thing was. Most unsettling thing about all this stuff is that it's apparent without many flashbacks being used. The Warriors of Hope try to put on a tough face, but their PTSD starts showing pretty quickly. It really is uncomfortable. That's not the end of it though. They all have one person they look up to, their big sis Junko. Yes, that Junko, the mastermind behind the Hope's Peak killing games. The girl who killed her own sister just because she couldn't do a good enough impression of her. The lunatic who plunged the entire world into chaos just to satiate her lust for despair. The character so deranged that if I were to make a list of the most evil video game characters, she would be guaranteed to be in the top 5. That Junko. Why did they pick her to look up to? Because she's the only authority figure to treat them with something resembling human decency. And even then, it's not much. They know she just sees them as pawns, as her playthings, and they don't care, because she at least gave them something to believe in. But even that was a lie. Junko only ever cared about their leader, Monica, and their crusade against the adults was just part of Monica's plan to create a successor for Junko. The Danganronpa series is no stranger to putting its characters through all sorts of hell, but at least it was teenagers. Here, it's freaking 10-year-olds caught in the crossfire, and it's pretty hard to watch. Hotline Miami is a series where the gameplay revolves around killing a ton of people, and one of the main themes is why the characters are actually doing it. Hotline Miami 2 in particular has a ton of playable characters. Each one has a different motive for killing, and some are more sympathetic than others. The fans are doing it to continue Jacket's legacy. Jake is being extorted and also wants to get back at the Russians. Evan Wright doesn't actually kill anyone, at least not intentionally, and is doing it to write his book. Richter is doing it to help take care of his mother, the son wants to rebuild the Russian cartel and make his father proud, and Beard is just a soldier on the front lines, so of course he's killing people. The overarching theme is that all of these people may also secretly enjoy the carnage deep down, but at least on the surface, they all have a decent reason for doing it. Manny Pardo, on the other hand, doesn't. Even the all-knowing Richard doesn't seem to understand why Pardo does what he does. At first, the answer seems obvious. Pardo's a cop, so he's obviously just stopping crimes. But then, evidence starts piling up against him. He constantly disobeys orders and acts very suspiciously. At first, you may think this is just because he's a really dedicated police officer, but then there's the matter of the Miami Mutilator. The Miami Mutilator is a serial killer that Pardo investigates throughout the game. However, it slowly becomes clear that Pardo is the Miami Mutilator. It also becomes clear that all his actions as a cop are for one purpose: attention. A lot of big events hit Miami over the course of the game. There's Jacket's trial, the drug war between the Russians and the Colombians, and of course, the emergence of Jacket's copycats, the fans. All of Pardo's actions when he's not trying to blend in are to promote the Mutilator, from urging Evan not to write his book on the Masked Maniac, to massacring the Colombians to ensure an easy victory for the Russians, to killing Tony before he can even stand trial. All of this is to diminish the attention those various events get, just so the news outlets will focus on the Miami Mutilator. In other words, him. Now I bet you're wondering why I put Pardo on here. What makes him the worst character in a game where you also play as murderous adrenaline junkies and a literal drug lord? Well, to start with, there's a certain amount of disgust that comes along with that kind of abuse of authority. No one expects a drug kingpin to act responsibly, but most people expect cops to do so. The other reason is motive. Wanting to make a parent proud or carry on the legacy of your hero are noble goals, even though their methods for doing so certainly aren't. Trying to get the media to focus on a string of murders that you committed? Only a sadistic egomaniac would do that. One thing that most of the villains on this list have in common is that they're all relatively complex characters. Number 1 on this list is actually quite simple, yet manages to be complex in their own way. Mustache Girl from A Hat in Time. You first meet her at the beginning of the game and team up with her to drive the Mafia out of Mafia Town. All goes well until you take down the leader of the Mafia. Mustache Girl figures out you can use the timepieces to time travel and asks Hat Kid to use them to fight evil. Hat Kid, needing the timepieces to get back home, refuses. Mustache Girl gets pretty angry about this and vows to collect all the timepieces herself, which she does at the end of the game, by stealing them from you. And she uses the timepieces to usher in a dystopian police state where she's judge, jury, and executioner, and everyone is on trial. Obviously, Hat Kid goes to confront her, and something interesting happens. In the middle of the fight, there's a pretty emotional scene where everyone tells Mustache Girl to get lost, and that she's ruining everything. She protests, saying that she's just making things better, and that she's doing it for the good of everyone. But no one agrees, and she gets defeated. Now I bet you're wondering, what puts Mustache Girl at number 1 over so many characters who have been through so much worse? Simply put, she's kind of right. Yes, she is too brutal and authoritarian, and yes, making your base of operations a castle filled with lava certainly isn't going to do you any favors in the heroism department, but really look at who's on trial here. The Mafia is, well, the Mafia. The Snatcher straight up steals people's souls and kills them, and even the conductor and DJ Grooves were willing to kill Hat Kid over a freaking film award. Plus, most of the others were working for one of the aforementioned people. Heck, are we even sure Hat Kid can be trusted? In the Seal the Deal DLC, she sinks an entire cruise liner just to get a timepiece. Sure, she saved everyone on board, but that was still a pretty big risk, and it clearly spoiled all of their vacations. Plus, it's not like Mustache Girl was blindly punishing people either. She opts to let Hat Kid go because she wasn't really doing anything that bad, even though they had gotten into a fight earlier. Mustache Girl's whole MO can be summed up by her time rift story. She lived peacefully on her island before the Mafia showed up, and when they did, despite her welcoming them with open arms, they took it over and ravaged the place, turning it into Mafia Town. Ever since then, she had been doing everything she could to sabotage them, and the title of the story is The Hero. Obviously. And that really sums it up. In most other circumstances, Mustache Girl would be the hero. Again, assuming she toned down the totalitarianism and lava castles. But the sad reality for her is that she's trying to provide justice and security to a planet that simply doesn't want it. Heck, even Hat Kid realizes this and tosses her a timepiece. Besides, at least she's better than a certain other character parading under the banner of justice. That's a segue into the next entry if you couldn't tell. Remember in Darkest Games Round 2 when I said this? However, the reason why this game is so high up on the list is because of its main character, Jack Boyd. In the first game, he was somewhat sympathetic. Sure, he was corrupt and did bad things, but there was a sense of him at the very least wanting to do the right thing, and you could tell his life was spiraling out of control. In This Is the Police 2, on the other hand, I honestly don't want to get into it because I plan on covering this in a future countdown. But let me just say, he is as despicable as it gets. And he's the main character. He's the one you're controlling. He's the one whose agenda you're helping to further. I think that speaks for itself. This was the video I was referring to, so let's get into it. We have a lot of ground to cover. Let's start with the first game. Like I said in that video, Jack does bad things in the first game, but you can tell he at least wants to do the right thing. He gets informed that he'll be fired in 180 days, so he aims to make $500,000 to make sure he has enough to live off of afterward, and so he can potentially win his wife back. Of course, that doesn't happen. After all the things he did to finally get her on the phone, she wants nothing to do with it. That's not all though. He's also made to be an involuntary involuntary mafia stooge, and he strikes up a friendship/romance with a prosecutor named Lana, but that all goes down the tubes when Robespierre leaks a file full of Jack's supposed crimes. Although, given Robespierre's tendency to doctor evidence, most of those crimes are probably fictional. Then, when Rogers and Chaffee go to war with each other, they both promise that Jack will keep his job if he sides with them, and then they immediately break that promise. Finally, when he's no longer police chief, he goes to his favorite club to find he's no longer welcome. And that's basically everything of note in the first game. It's a story of people using Jack for his position of power and throwing him away once they've gotten what they want. Now on to the game that's actually important for this list. At the beginning of This Is the Police 2, Jack is a broken, pathetic mess. Since the entire Freeburg police force is after him, he's fled to Sharpwood and taken the alias Warren Nash. However, he gets found out pretty quickly and is arrested, but manages to make the most out of the situation. He bargains with Sharpwood's police chief, Lily, who tries her best but just doesn't know how to run the station. Jack offers to help her out and takes on half the workload, while also providing a tough presence to prevent the officers from walking all over her. At first, it seems like Jack really wants to help Lily grow as an officer and run the station well. Sure, he can be a bit strict and tough, but that's it, right? Well, things start to shift in one of the game's most iconic moments, the "Why am I here" scene. Basically, Jack beats the ever-loving crap out of Officer Charlie, which is hard to blame him for, given the dude was threatening to blow his head off a couple nights ago. In response, Lily calls Jack into her office to discuss it, and in a very uncomfortable scene, Jack makes it clear to Lily that he can do whatever he wants. And there's nothing she can do because she needs him to run the department.
It's a simple question, and the answer is also simple. Why am I here?
Jack, I don't know what you...
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? Some bearded old man with fake documents strikes up a conversation with you, and suddenly he's...
Jack, please, you know how much this...
becoming the sheriff's right hand. Actually doing all the work of the sheriff. How does that happen, Lily? Come on, tell me.
And it only gets worse from there. There's the arrival of Captain Britt Carter. Carter believes that someone who grew up in Sharpwood should be running things and challenges Jack for his spot. However, at the end, he confesses that he cheated and that he knew who Jack really was. Carter urges Jack to leave Sharpwood and move on to another town. Understanding this as a threat, Jack has him killed. But things really start getting serious when Lana shows up, determined to bring Jack to justice. Lily realizes that this will lead to her getting jailed as well, and since Jack doesn't have a plan to deal with it, she asks Colonel Henderson to get rid of him. Once Jack finds out about this, he flees back to Freeburg to try to get help from his old friend, Ethan Palmer. However, when Palmer tells Jack to turn himself in, Jack breaks down in his most vulnerable moment in the entire series. It's then followed by a minigame called Save Jack's Soul, where you have to prevent Jack from being corrupted by these demon creatures. The minigame is literally impossible, and when you fail, the last bit of good left inside Jack Boyd dies. First thing he does when he gets back to Sharpwood is shoot Lana. He then drafts up a plan with Colonel Henderson to get Lily killed, but even Henderson can't fully see what Jack has planned. In the days leading up to the planned shootout, Jack kills everyone who knows his true identity, one by one. First, the college kid who figured it out, then Moreno, who was a huge fanboy of Jack's and would likely never tell anyone his secret. Then, Jack plants a bomb on Lily's snowmobile before the big night even happens. He also makes sure that Henderson dies in the shootout, and he even kills poor Fry. Wait, never mind, he totally had it coming. After the credits, though, it gets revealed he even killed Emma, his former secretary in Freeburg, who did nothing but try to help Jack. He killed her because she was still one last loose end. So, what puts Jack at number 1? Well, there's several things. For starters, with everyone else on this list, they were bad from the get-go. With Jack, you see the slow transition from a corrupt but still well-meaning cop to a brutal dictator. Then, there's the matter of the way the player is supposed to feel about these characters. characters. All the other characters on this list are meant to be somewhat likable to the player. The CEO of Feeble is pretty funny, and you can at least admire his resourcefulness. Trevor is freaking hilarious and at least has some morals. The cave characters all serve as good cautionary tales of when desire goes too far, and heck, even Pardo carries an air of mystery to him. With Jack, he goes utterly berserk. You start off wanting to believe he's a good person, but get let down every step of the way. As the game progresses, Robespierre's accusations seem less like baseless slander and more like the truth. Each scene where he kills someone, even though most of the time you don't even see him do it and it's just implied, it feels like something straight out of a horror movie. This is The Police 2, clearly aimed to create a protagonist that you absolutely despised by the end of the game, possibly making you feel uncomfortable with the fact that you helped him advance his agenda, and they succeeded. I am Defaultalizer, and before I go, there's a couple of collabs I was in that I want to shout out. One of them is the Mario RPG video I talked about last time. Yes, it's finally out. And the other is a podcast I guest starred in. It's about potential Smash DLC fighters. Just keep in mind, this was before E3. Be sure to check them out if you're interested. Bye!